Good evening and welcome to this episode of the Barry Trump Show. I am so excited and honored to have as my guest tonight, Ellie Velshi. Ellie, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you outside of the context of your show. And it's been a bit of a wild ride.
Yeah.
But let's keep it to the last few months because otherwise, who
Otherwise,
knows?
we need several of these episodes.
Exactly. Yeah, we would need an entire
Yeah.
limited series or unlimited series, as the
Yeah.
case may be. But a couple of things I want to talk to you today have to do with your exemplary work in Ukraine and how the situation in Ukraine plays out in America, how it doesn't. But let's start with the most obvious. The midterms were quite something. And I'm just eager to get your take on the framing leading up to them, the results, and the potential fallout.
So I think the biggest part of the framing leading up to them, which is interesting and sort of a learning opportunity for us, is that we measure presidential popularity a certain way, and we've been measuring it the same way for years and years and years. So going into this election, we knew that the measure of Joe Biden's popularity was around 44, 45%, depending on what polls you looked at,
Right.
which was relatively low compared to recent presidents. So it was not meant to help him. In the case where the president, the party that holds the White House, would typically lose seats in the midterm elections unless there was some unusual event like after 9/11 when George W. Bush didn't. You would think that the lower popularity levels of the president would contribute to a greater loss. And what I'm realizing, I'm an economics guy. It's a little like GDP. You can tell people what GDP growth is because it's the only measure we have of all the things we produce and sell in the economy. But sometimes it's not reflective of what's really happening out there. So you can generally think that Joe Biden isn't exactly the president you'd want him to be, isn't perhaps as robust as you'd like him to be, although his schedule belies that, might be a little old for the job. Whatever you think about him registers as your approval or disapproval. But when it comes down to a binary choice of, in this particular elections, Republicans versus Democrats, or people who are working against democracy versus people who are working for democracy, or a party that has no platform and seems to be enthralled to a particular man versus a party that's done some things that you might not think are important, like the CHIPS Act or whatever the case is, but real things have happened. What happens is that popularity rating goes into the back of your head. It's not a forefront application. It's a background application. It's saying, all right, I don't think he's all that, but he's actually pretty good. Now, I think what history is going to demonstrate, Mary, is that Joe Biden ends up 15 years from now and 20 years from now looking very different. He ends up looking a little more like Jimmy Carter does, where, at the time, everybody thought Jimmy Carter was not a good president. And it turns out that he did some remarkable things, and he subsequently did more remarkable things after he was president. Or George H.W. Bush, who presided over the reunification of Eastern Europe, which just didn't feel like a tangible and important thing to a lot of people at the time, and resulted in something really, really massive later down the line. He ended up being a more statesman-like character. The bottom line here is Joe Biden doesn't have that kind of time. So people have to register right now that A, he's actually a really good president. B, he's really effective. C, he's the only president since Ronald Reagan who has brought America's chief adversary to their knees in Ukraine. And D, if Donald Trump is actually running for president, like he says he is, there are a lot of people who say, I'd rather have somebody else be the Democratic nominee, or I'd rather have somebody other than Joe Biden. But a lot of people are going to go through all the options, and they're going to arrive back at Joe Biden.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But I want to get back to the economy because, as you say, you are an economy guy, and one of the great services you provide for those of us who may not understand what the economy actually is. It's not a monolith,
right?
It's not one metric, and I think one of the great disservices that a lot of the mainstream media did in this running up to this midterm election was present the economy as if it were two things: high gas prices and inflation.
Yes.
And also saying it's those two things without explaining or putting in context the reason why
it is. Right.
Exactly. So the other thing that got left out of the conversation, again, not your conversations, which is why I think one of the many reasons your work is so important, is that other things were pulled out and separated from the economy, which always ranks almost always ranks
Almost always, yeah.
one, and pretending that things like abortion rights and democracy aren't also economic issues.
Correct. You're 100% right. So there were several things at play. The first thing, I think, for people who struggle with being comfortable talking about the economy is that they think I don't really know numbers and I don't really know math and things like that. The economy is not science, it's art. Right? It is
Right.
all things that happen that cause you to behave a certain way. You, your employer, your company, all of us writ large. So that's why I wish, if we had, back in the days when we decided to teach economics, we had thought about that. We had decided, let's just teach economy as human behavior. Human behavior around the resources that you have, which in most people's case is money, or don't have enough of. So number one, if you were to take a snapshot of the economy right now, which is, by the way, better than it was a week ago, but if we were to take a snapshot of the economy on the day before the election, what you have was historically high inflation that was trending down, inflation that is not as high in the United States as it is in about 100 other countries.
Yeah.
So to the extent that there were Republicans blaming Joe Biden and the Democrats for inflation, you'd have to sort of come to the belief that Joe Biden and Democrats rule the world, are globalists, as Breitbart likes to say. Because how is Netherlands inflation, UK inflation today, 11.1%? It's a historic number. France, Turkey, well, Turkey's up in the 80%. Venezuela's way out there. But let's just talk about countries that aren't, like Mexico, like Germany, like Spain, like 100% of the countries in the EU. So first of all, inflation's really a problem, and it's really a thing, and it should have been debated properly. But Republicans blame Democrats for it, and then also offered no solution to it, because the difficulty about fighting inflation is that there's one way to do it, and it includes raising interest rates, and it's unpleasant and it's hard, and the Fed's really been doing it, and that's a different discussion for a different time. But the government's doing exactly what the government should be doing about it, and Republicans had no other answer. But take inflation out of the equation for a second. You have remarkably low unemployment. Right? We used to, in economics, we used to say 5% unemployment is considered full employment, meaning everybody who wants a job has a job. We're way below that.
Yeah.
Go to a restaurant and try to get served today. Something that I used to go to Joe and the Juice here and ask for a turkey sandwich, and it would take 4 minutes to get it. Now it takes 15 or 20 minutes because there's one person serving, because they can't hire a second person. Look at wages, which we used to struggle to say. Federal wages are $7.25 an hour. People wanted them at $10. Then they said $12. Even Republicans came around to $10 and $12. Then Bernie Sanders and others wanted $15 an hour. We're basically at $15 an hour without any legislation. The market has caused wages to go up. I understand that's the chief component of inflation right now, but it's really good for wage earners.
Right.
Take a look at spending, way up. Gross domestic product is 2.3% or something. You have to be below zero to be in a recession. So in fact, if you look at the economy writ large, it's actually pretty good. But if most of your money goes toward buying gas and eggs and meat and cheese, it feels very, very immediate to you. So what we need to do is not discount the fact that people are hurt by inflation. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But it's not these guys' fault. We are working to solve it. And other parts of the economy are doing well. This is your best opportunity to get a job probably in 15 years. And so that's why we have to have nuanced conversations about the economy. The problem in elections is there's nuance nothing, right? It's all bumper stickers.
Yeah.
And there were complaints that the Democrats didn't message around that as well as they should have. And I certainly took on the complaint that Republicans were messaging about it quite effectively, blaming it on them. So I would go out of my way to show charts of all the places in the world that had higher inflation than America had, and say, how do you think that's Joe Biden's problem? Are you going to throw all the bums out all around the world because of it? Because it is just a thing. So the economy, this is a failing, right? We don't talk about it enough, and we don't talk about it well enough, and we don't make it accessible enough for people to not get hoodwinked. But Mary, on Tuesday night last week, they didn't get hoodwinked. Americans were able to hold two thoughts in their own mind. I don't like these high prices. I also don't like anti-democratic forces trying to steal our vote and do things like that. And to your final point, If you have a baby that you weren't planning to have, that's the biggest economic thing that will ever happen to you. That will take a woman out of the workforce, and it will be best case scenario, $250,000 of their money through the course of their life. That's the best and lowest case scenario. All right. So
Yeah.
that's a whole lot of other problems. So telling me that I had this debate with a Republican and a Democrat in Michigan, where the woman who was an abortion rights activist, Democrat, said, I think abortion is an economic issue. And the man who was a Republican said, that's a luxury for suburban moms to think about. Yikes.
Wow.
It's not a luxury. The ability to have an abortion is not
Wow.
actually luxury. And by the way, we missed the whole conversation about it's okay if you don't like abortion. Like this, we're in a pluralistic society. You can not like abortion and you can never have an abortion and never avail yourself of one. But don't make the argument that it's not an economic decision for someone else.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and that's also incredibly offensive that what that person said. But a lot of what's happening in the context of that issue is really offensive. But the other thing, first of all, love Joe and the Juice. Very fond of their turmeric shot.
It's very good.
And I'm willing to wait for it. But one of the problems with pretty much anything that is political is the extent to which these things get treated like both sides have legitimate points, right? And you mentioned that the Republicans, again, continue to be better at messaging than the Democrats, unfortunately. They hammer Democrats on the economy, on inflation. As you said, they have no solutions. But what always seems to get left out of the conversation, and again, it's as if by mentioning it, you're biased somehow, is that the only party that has actual solutions, the only party that has legislation, not to do anything about inflation because there's only so much you can do, but to mitigate the effects of inflation.
Right.
Is the Democratic Party.
Right. So this is the important part. If you go back to the beginning of COVID, two things were happening simultaneously. One is the Federal Reserve said, if money gets blocked up, if banks stop lending money to companies dry up, they lose their cash flow, they lay people off, and they will have a big problem. Right. So in America, central reserves, the central bank and central banks all around the world said, let's keep money flowing to companies. That's going to be the number one thing. In places like Denmark, they actually paid corporations to pay their staff. If you kept your staff on payroll, even if they had no work to do and had to stay home, the government actually paid for it. It was an interesting experiment. But basically, in the rest of the world, we said, we'll make sure companies get money. Then there was an effort to get real people money. Right. And that hung around Congress, and everybody was wringing their hands about, what happens if you give people who are paycheck to paycheck money? They use it on drugs and they use it on entertainment. I mean, it's just ridiculous, old-fashioned welfare queen BS. Right. But my point is, our institutions are built to make sure companies don't fail if they need money, and the wealthy have money. And I'm not a socialist. I'm an economics journalist. I probably am more conservative than I am liberal about economics. But we don't have systems by which people who are subject to these economic forces, i.e. recession and inflation, can be helped in an easy way by the rest of us. We save banks all the time. We save corporations all the time. We make sure the money flow between banks never, ever stops. And the Federal Reserve is able to do that without any political interference whatsoever. They don't have to answer to anyone to do it. When the Fed raises rates, it does it on its own. When it cuts rates, it does it on its own. But for humans, it has to go through Congress. And boy, does every human have to prove, I really need that money to feed my kid. I really need to do that. So in the case of inflation, it's a massive tax on people. If you are someone who's working paycheck to paycheck, you can't really afford that your grocery bill is now 10% higher than it was. Your gasoline prices are coming down, but they're still high. And we don't have mechanisms to help them. That is always politicized. There's no politicization to helping banks and corporations, with minor exceptions, like in the 2008 recession, where they had that big bill, which actually turned out to work really well.
And that's because it was a Democrat.
Right. And we bailed out the auto industry, and everybody hated that, but it actually worked out well. The bottom line is, actually, when you give people money when they're in trouble, especially people or companies that have to spend that money to stay afloat, the return to the government tends to be very, very, very high. We made money on the auto bailout. We made money on the TARP. We made money on all that kind of stuff. But God forbid you give people money or you help them out with child care or elder care or the things they need. That was all part of the Build Back Better bill that Republicans wanted no part of. Then they finally agreed to the second bill. Well, some of them did. Most of them voted against it, but they loved it. They all campaign on it. They talk about it. While at the other side of their mouth, they're talking about the fact that these are the things that are causing inflation. So yes, the Republican Party is a party without a platform. And I wish that weren't true, Mary, because I don't believe in single party states. I would like to have debates about where interest rates should be, where wages should be, what kind of health care we should be providing to people, how you help people when they're facing inflation. And ultimately, we may have a recession as a result of this. What will we do then? How will we keep that recession as short as possible? The one thing to remember about both inflation and recession, they're really bad for most people. They're really good for the top 5%.
That's right.
They're super good for the top 1%, and they're amazingly good for the top 0.1%, because those people don't have to borrow money. They have money. They can deploy it. When the stock market goes down, they back up the truck and buy stocks. When home prices go down, like they're going down right now, they go in and buy houses. They don't have to struggle with mortgage rates at 6 or 7% because they don't need the mortgage to buy the house. So you buy a cheap house and you sit on it till the price, because the prices will go up. Stock market will go up again. Home prices will go up again. This is America. This is a place that everybody in the world wants to come and live. And so that's where we are right now, that we need two parties. We need debate. We need the best ideas possible. And it's just not happening.
It's so true that, because I listen, I'm a liberal, very liberal, progressive, but I'm also a pragmatist. And I think part of me feels that the country would be better off if for a solid 12 years, the Democrats had control of everything, because there's so much to be fixed. Like, so much damage has been done that we need to fix. But that's not tenable for the long term. As you say, we need input from different sectors of the population. We need robust debate. But that also can't happen, though, if one party, as you said, is a party without policy. But as we've learned, much to our chagrin, is a party that's actually anti-democratic. What do we do about that? Because honestly, Ali, it feels like, two things. Now, obviously, it's different a week out from last week's election, but before that, I think we could safely say that things were actually worse in many ways, in many important ways, than they were after Joe Biden won in 2020.
Sure.
Right. And the Republican Party has continued to go down this very dark path. And whatever they're saying today, I think it's safe to assume that they are going to do what the most expedient thing, if they think it's going to help them retain power.
Yes.
And at the moment, that looks to be like appeasing Donald Trump. What do we do about that?
Sort of looks like it, right? I've sort of been monitoring since Donald Trump announced his election and his candidacy, and I'm actually a bit surprised by the tepid response from a lot of people, including Republicans, who are, for the moment at least, and maybe this is just the shadow of Tuesday's election, like the days after January 6th were a shadow that, once the shadow passes, everybody's back on board. But I think you're right in distinguishing a party without a platform is one problem. A party with what seems to be a platform that counters democracy is a bigger one. Now, this is where it's important to take a wider view, and that is the view that I've had for the last several months, particularly because I was in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, and starting to study autocracy and dictatorship. And I learned two things. One is democracy's on retreat, generally speaking, in the world. Right. There's more autocracy and dictatorship coming in than not. And generally speaking, it's not someone who comes into power and eliminates democracy. It's people themselves who vote for politicians who have this Donald Trump-ish, I alone can fix it view, but you got to give me all the power.
Right.
There can be no compromise. I will fix it. So people actually vote for these people. And the vote never gets taken away. Ruth Ben-Ghiat and I talk about this a lot, right? We think that as long as we can go out and cast our ballot on Tuesday, November 8th, and in whatever elections we're good.
Right.
But that's not how it works. What happens if you look at countries like Iran and Russia and a whole lot of others, they have elections.
Hungary.
Then Hungary has elections, but you start to not be able to be a candidate if you don't have a particular view, or it becomes very hard for you to do so. Or in the United States, the Republican Party infrastructure will not support a challenger to Donald Trump. So your vote in Iran never, ever, 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 ever went away. Under fundamentalist Muslims, your vote never went away. Your vote in Russia doesn't go away, but God help you if you vote the wrong direction. And by the way, God help you if your neighborhood, when they tally up the votes, 15% of the population voted against Putin's regime, they'll bulldoze the houses. So you don't do it. You vote. And by the way, you show up to vote. So these countries all brag in those referendums in the Russian controlled areas of Ukraine. Turnout was like 96, 98%, whatever. And the votes were all 98% to 2. I don't even know why they bother faking the 2%. Iran is the same way. Turnout is very high because the police check you to make sure you turn out. I like high turnout, but my point is the vote is not the thing you have to worry about. A lot of Americans feel secure in the fact that we still have the vote. They make it a little hard for some people in Texas and Georgia to vote, but fundamentally they can do it. We'll vote. No, they change things around the edges. They tamper with the results of the elections, or they tell you that they're tampering with the results of the elections so that you don't think that the system matters. They run candidates like they did in Arizona and in Pennsylvania and in Michigan who have no other credentials except to deny the last election and tell you that they'll do that for the next election. You end up with a Secretary of State in a state like Indiana who is an election denier. Mary, I can honestly say I didn't know the name of a single Secretary of State in America 3 years ago. Just didn't occur to me. Why would I even know them? Weren't entirely clear what they did. Now they will decide the outcome of elections.
That's
Almost
right.
every one of them lost, but an election denier in Indiana won.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to have to pay a lot of attention to Indiana in the next election to say, are these free and fair elections? Do we need election monitors like Jimmy Carter going around to elections in America like we send around the world? So that's what people need to worry about. We did not dodge a bullet when Joe Biden was elected. We did not dodge a bullet because January 6th didn't succeed. And we did not dodge a bullet on November 8th, 2022. The bullets are still all flying out there. They just haven't hit their mark. And the shooters are getting substantially more sophisticated about how to hit their targets.
And again, we continue to be in this position where the next election becomes the most important election, which is exhausting.
Yeah, it totally is.
Frankly,
the sky is falling, except it is.
It is.
It's actually falling.
And that creates a situation, a very dangerous situation, in which it becomes easier for those malign forces to normalize the attacks, to normalize the continuing erosion of our institutions and people's faith in elections, etc. And I don't really like to talk about Donald a lot because I don't believe he's the problem. I believe the party that continues to empower him is the problem. Mm-hmm. But the normalization of him is also a problem. I mean, we're looking at the fact that a man who started the big lie because he lost so badly in 2020, his ego couldn't handle it, and his party outperformed him, which just made it worse. A man who incited an insurrection against his own government and continues to spread both the big lie and to justify the behavior of the insurrectionists, was allowed to announce his candidacy for the presidency.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was surprising necessarily, but the tepidness of the response, I think, speaks to some exhaustion. I think it speaks to some anger about how poorly the Republicans fared in the midterm. But as soon as Donald starts making threats, or as soon as his numbers start going up, or what have you, they'll snap back into line.
Sure they will.
And he will be completely enabled and what's the word I'm looking for? Supported by a media that seems, not again across the board, but generally speaking, incapable of describing exactly who he is and why this should not be allowed to happen. And part of that, Ellie, is that I think, although my faith in this has been restored a little bit since last week, but remember, tens and tens of millions of people voted for election deniers, voted for people who claimed that they were going to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think, yes, democracy, once again, we snatch democracy from the jaws of autocracy. But as you just said, it's still a very tenuous relationship we have to our democracy. And part of the problem is I think people don't quite understand what it means and what our relationship is to it. Democracy is not an end, it's
100%.
a process, right?
Yeah. Because if you're born here, you're born with your citizenship. So you don't have to go through any contests or jump through any hoops to figure out what it is. Those of us who are naturalized, when I was naturalized in 2015, you go into the courthouse and they take away your phone. You can't have your phone in a courthouse, but they do give you a constitution. And so I read the Constitution. You can read it in the waiting time that I had. I think I could read it about 3 times. And it sinks in, right? It reminds you that, all right, and plus you have to do a test to become a citizen. It's an easy test, but you have to think about these things that are important. And the fight for liberty and democracy and freedom in the United States is too far removed. That's why being in Eastern Europe and Ukraine earlier this year was very helpful to me, because it's not removed to them. It's live. If you want to know why these Ukrainians are beating the Russians, it's because it's live. Their actual democracy is slipping away. And the Poles and the Latvians and the Lithuanians, they're all looking at the same things, thinking we're one invasion away. We're 40 miles away from democracy being taken. Now, that's not going to happen in America. We're not going to have missiles flying and somebody else's tanks coming, but it's almost more dangerous. It's our own tanks. It's our own military. It's our own people who are turning on us, because for all of the important people who didn't win, the important deniers who didn't win, meaning the governors, the Secretary of States, the Senate candidates, although some did. Ron Johnson is a denier. He won. Lots of them got reelected.
Vance.
One Secretary of State did. Lots and lots of people at lower levels did, because Americans think it's benign. Lots of people think it's benign. The Ron DeSantis's of the world are sitting here thinking Republicans didn't en masse refute election denialism. I mean, I spoke to people in Michigan and in Arizona and in Pennsylvania who absolutely did, right? Josh Shapiro won in Pennsylvania because Republicans supported him against Doug Mastriano. Katie Hobbs and Adrian Fontes, who became these Secretary of State, and key people in Arizona won because they're proud of their Republicanism, right? They're proud of John McCain. They're proud of Barry Goldwater. They're proud of being independent thinkers. They're proud of being conservatives. They didn't want this BS of election denial out there. But en masse, that's not what Republican voters did, which means there's still a seed that can be germinated of, I'm still going to go down this road. I'm still going to doubt elections. I'm still going to seed the doubt. And we have such close elections in this country that that's all you need to do. It'll cause some people to sit on their hands and not go to the ballots. Some people will be intimidated because guys with guns stand outside of ballot boxes. Some people say, my vote's not going to get counted. It's not going to matter anyway. In New York, people do that all the time, right? They think, oh, well, the Democrat's going to win. Well, it was going to be a close election for governor.
That's right.
In New York. You can't ever do that. Democracy is a cactus. It's not a hard plant to maintain, but it needs some love. You cannot stick a cactus in your bottom drawer for 20 years and hope it's alive. You have to do a little bit of work. It needs sun. It needs a little bit of water from time to time if things have been too dry for it. That's what we need to do. Everybody needs to understand that they have responsibility for a little part of this cactus, or a little cactus on their own. The other thing people need to remember is they say to me all the time, wow, you've got a front row seat to such historic times. And I think to myself, this isn't a front row seat. I'm in the arena, and so are all of you. We're all in this arena ourselves. We're not watching this game. You are in the battle. So are you a foot soldier for democracy, or are you not? I'm not asking you your opinion on what minimum wage should be or how healthcare should be distributed in this country. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Peter Meyer, Joe Walsh, all of these people and I are in exactly the same arena right now. We are fighting on the same side of the same battle. When this game is over, I don't want to call it a game, but when this battle is over, we'll all go back to our own teams. And
Yep.
Walsh and I will argue about wages. And Liz Cheney and I will argue about probably everything. And lots of us will argue about abortion, and we'll argue about climate change. But that's not the fight to have today. Today, the fight is only about democracy. And I know that's hard to get into people's brains because we didn't grow up thinking democracy itself would be at risk. Now we have to get that through our heads, because this was the most important election in a generation, and so too will the next one be.
It's such a, I love the cactus analogy, because it's true. You don't need to, you actually shouldn't water a cactus every day, but
No.
you can't forget it exists.
Correct.
And that does seem to be what we take so much for granted here. And that's why I think a huge opportunity has been missed vis-a-vis the ways in which the American people have understood or not failed to understand what's happening in Ukraine.
Yes.
Again, the work you did, I'm so grateful for it, because as an American, foreign policy or what's happening in the rest of the world is not something that comes to me, or sorry, interest in it is not what comes to me naturally, because even though I pay attention probably as much, well, more than most, as do you, we aren't raised to think anything other than all that happens. The only thing that matters is what happens in America.
Right.
I was talking to some people in Australia, and they were talking about how they pay so much attention to what's happening here, and what do Americans think of Australia? I'm like, we don't.
Canadian, I'm Canadian. Canadians ask me all the time, what do Americans think about Canada? It's like, no, not so much.
They know it exists, probably.
Somebody went to the Olympics once. Somebody went to Montreal sometime. It's benign.
Yeah.
They don't think about it much.
And I don't think it isn't until situations like Ukraine arise that we see how incredibly dangerous that level of ignorance and lack of interest can be, because Ali, it played out on so many different levels. One, most basically, and certainly not most importantly, but in the context of our latest election, was important. Part of the reason that high gas prices are so high is because of what's happening in Ukraine, and is because of all of the illegal maneuvers that Russia is making, and Saudi Arabia as well, in terms of manipulating gas prices to undermine the Biden administration. But it's it's something that, if it isn't explained in that way, then it just becomes this bad thing the Biden administration is doing. But much more importantly, and this is again why your reporting was so crucial, is that the fight in Ukraine is a fight for democracy everywhere. And if that domino falls, I'm not really sure what happens next.
You're right. And Volodymyr Zelensky, who was not a popular guy, a lot of people didn't support him. He was a satirist. People didn't think he could be taken seriously, shouldn't be a president of a country where Russia is the adversary, thought to not be corrupt in a country that suffers from corruption. And a lot of people said, I think he's actually not corrupt, which is why he can't be our president, because a non-corrupt guy can't. I met all sorts of people all across Ukraine with 96 reasons about why they didn't vote for Volodymyr Zelensky, except he articulated what you just said. This is the front line of the battle for democracy. If you let this fall, we will lose it. So that's number one. Number two, you were talking about your interest in sort of understanding of foreign policy. It's an abstraction for most people. I don't think people are willfully ignorant, just an abstraction. I mean, in the 2 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, I literally spent all my shows with maps of Ukraine, showing everybody where it is in the grander scheme of things, what the countries are around it, what NATO is, because some of us remember, some of us don't remember why NATO was formed, what NATO was in the 70s, what it was in the 80s, how it expanded with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, just to give people context. And then I went there, and when I first went, I went to Hungary, and then I went to Poland, then I went into Ukraine, and all I did was talk to mostly women and elderly people getting off of trains with their children at train stations to say, that's not abstract. Everybody has a mother, a sister, a daughter, a grandmother, and children. right? Everybody knows what that looks like. These
Yeah.
people have been on a train for 30 hours. And when you get on a train with your kids for 30 hours and you don't know where you're going, you don't take your fun stuff. You take strollers, you take carriers, you take food, you take that kind of stuff. They get off at a train station. There's feminine hygiene products, there's medication, there's antibiotics, there's sandwiches, there's all SIM cards because your phone doesn't work.
Right.
Your credit cards don't work. There's nowhere to get money. Then you go through this room where you get all that kind of stuff. They take care of your health needs and your food needs and all that kind of stuff. Then you get to the other side and you have nowhere to go and you have no money for a cab and you have no house to stay in. Then they are matching you up with people who have volunteered to keep you or embassies who've come in and said, stay in this hotel till we get you a flight home. That's what war is. That's the abstraction that war is. It's not, I can tell you everything about every kind of missile and every kind of tank and every kind of airplane and all that kind of stuff, but that's the abstraction. That's game war. People war is what this is. And remember, all these people were minding their own business. They had struggled for 20 years to build a democracy. It was deeply flawed. Ours is also flawed.
Yes, it is.
But things happened to them and they realized they were about to lose it. And so the men had to stay. And by the way, they mostly stayed willingly. I didn't meet a man of fighting age in Ukraine who said he was trying to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And they are fighting for their country and they are winning, ostensibly with our help, but they are winning. And so this is, I think every American should be looking at Ukraine, not saying, yeah, the good guys are winning, because they are. But more importantly, they are fighting for their democracy the way we fought for our democracy once. And then the way we had a suffrage movement where we fought for a better democracy. And then we had a civil rights movement where we fought for a yet better democracy. Then we had Me Too, which was a fairer democracy. Then we had Black Lives Matter, which was also a more perfect union we were trying to figure out. We are a continuum just like they are. They're just earlier in it, and the fights involve guns. We need to be inspired by them to say, we can get to yet more perfect. I don't know if we'll ever get perfect in America, but let us be inspired by them. Let us be inspired by the women of Iran right now who've said, I've had it with this. I'm not taking this anymore. You're entirely out of touch with us. I want some rights. There are these nascent movements around the world that we as Americans, as leaders of this, should be encouraging and then learning from and saying, why don't we do this here? And in fairness, Mary, we have been doing it in America, right? There are real protests. We had 5 ballot measures about abortion this election, plus one in August in Kansas. All of them ended up supporting abortion rights in places like Kansas, Montana, and Kentucky, which otherwise voted conservative across the board. We've got marches. We've got people fighting for rights. So I actually, despite the fact that we've been talking for almost 40 minutes about things that seem generally pessimistic, I am not pessimistic about this. I actually believe we have enough inspiration around us and in us to solve this problem.
Actually, before the election, I was one of the few people who was optimistic about what was going to happen in the midterms. Anytime anybody said that we were going to lose the House really badly and probably the Senate, they now owe me a spa day for all of the stress that they put me through.
Right.
But actually, I was so optimistic that I'm a little disappointed that we
were more optimistic than the results actually bore out.
But that's okay. I think there were, in fact, I think having a close margin in the House with the Republicans in charge is not necessarily a bad thing. But the way you put that is, it is inspiring. And I think if Americans could also look at all of the fighting for democracy and for rights that are going on, if we could also look at that as a fight for us as well, I think the more engaged we are on that level, the better, because then perhaps it will put in a more enlightening context the fact that in this country, the people fighting against rights is one of our 2 major political parties.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. And we've already had, I don't know how it's going to shake down, and experts tell me it's not something to worry about too much, but you've heard Kevin McCarthy and a number of Republicans say, no more blank check to Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there. I was going to ask you about that. Please say more, because it is, regardless of what happens, it's alarming. It's alarming.
And so first of all, there are way more Republicans in the House who would not agree with that view. It's a very minority view. But Ukraine is a strategic partner for America. There's a reason we are supporting Ukraine, not just because we like Ukraine. And by the way, I'm of the view that you should just support countries that get invaded by other countries, because that's what the whole point of the UN is. But there's more than that. Russia is an expansionist adversary led by somebody who does not seem to share sort of this global understanding of what our worldview is. So if you let people like that run roughshod, they don't know what limits are, and they will continue to press those limits further and further. So, and by the way, China's got a similar issue going on. So we actually have to take strong stands. And you're finding in the middle of this, Joe Biden telling the Chinese, this is our red line. If you do this into Taiwan, we will be there to do something about it. So I do think that it is important to think of these things holistically. This isn't Ukraine, which generally speaking, most of my viewers have never thought about, unless they know somebody from Ukraine or have been there or are from there. You've never thought about, does not seem to be a place of much consequence. It's the poorest country in Europe, or one of the poorest in Europe. This is a principle. This is an idea that we decided after World War II. We decided earlier in that by forming the League of Nations, but we decided after World War II with the United Nations that we as a group of nations do not agree that a country can overtake another country against its will. And until recently, until Crimea, what you had was problems where dictators and oppressors were in their own countries, right? So what they did to the Rohingya, what the Syrians did to their own people, what the Libyans did to their own people, what the Afghans, the Taliban did to their own people, what Saddam Hussein did to his own people. There's no mechanism in the world to deal with that whatsoever. Right. So for all the horrific things that the Syrians did, there is nothing that the United Nations can do except condemn it. But we actually exist to stop member nations from going into other member nations. And Russia is a member of the Security Council of the United Nations. There needs to be real sanction. People like that need to be told, you will not trade with us. We will not buy your oil, which is why oil is expensive. Gas is expensive. We will put pressure on countries like India, who continue to buy Russian oil. We will do these things. So the energy secretary here, Jennifer Granholm, told me at one point, I interviewed her early on in this war, and she said, yeah, gas prices are high because we've made decisions about how we're going to treat Russia, because we're going to cut off their major supply to foreign funds. But that's our cost for democracy. Americans need to understand it's not fair. It's not right that Joe Schmo, who's got nothing to do with any war and has no opinion on the matter, is now paying more for their gas because of democracy. But that's a democracy tax. It is what it is. I'm sad about it because I also pay more for gas, but I have to realize I'm part of something bigger. And we have to apply this to our own country with abortion rights, with voting rights, with Black Lives Matter, with Me Too, because what Me Too means in an economics to a guy like me is women are going to be paid more, or should be paid more, for what they do and be treated more fairly in the workplace. Well, it's not a zero-sum game. That might mean some evening out of salaries. Democracy, freedom, justice, and liberty and equality cost us something. And if it costs you nothing, Mary, then it's just a slogan. You cannot stand there and say, I'm for women's rights. I'm for Black Lives Matters. I'm for Slava Ukraini. I'm for democracy. It's got to cost those of us who have privilege and control, who do not struggle to vote, who do not have to think about abortions, who do not have to face discrimination, who get paid more than women who do the same thing in life, who are not likely to be killed by police when they get pulled over. It is not for us to just say we're on the right side. It is for us to say, here in America and abroad, there will be some cost to us to make this a more just world. And I think the reward on the other side is going to be fantastic for all of us, including people like me with a great deal of privilege. I want a fairer world. That will be my reward. When the Ukrainians win, that will be my reward. When women are paid equally in this country, that will be my reward. When Black people don't have to be scared about being pulled over by police, that will be my reward. I will personally, as Ali Velshi, gain nothing by these things, but I will live in a better world. And I think as Ali Velshi, I will gain because the world is better.
And Ali, the idea that democracy as a zero-sum game has been injected into our politics is one of the more dangerous ideas, along with the idea that cruelty is somehow strength and a legitimate strategy for getting elected to something, right? Yep. And I think it's one of the things, hopefully, that will come out of this midterm is the idea that democracy is fragile, does need to be fought for, and by the way, we're not really a democracy yet. It's not only that we're not more perfect yet, we're not really a democracy yet. And it is only unless and until we recalibrate in the ways you just suggested that we can make it to the next level. And, when Kevin McCarthy talks about not supporting Ukraine, and others in the party seem to be quite pro Putin and pro Russia. When they are allowed to pretend that the problem is Antifa or Black Lives Matter and not the actual white domestic terrorists that are the biggest problem in this country in terms of security right now, then the task becomes harder. So I'm really concerned about the extent to which anti-democratic forces become normalized over time. And how do you see that going forward? Because we started here, I think. Donald announces his candidacy as if that's okay. And a lot of the coverage is to talk about
it's normal, as if it's a guy who's running for president.
Yeah.
And so think about what's happened in the last 6 months. We had a raid on Mar-a-Lago. We had people talking about civil war online. We had a guy in, I think it was Cincinnati, attack an FBI office. we've had various other smaller versions of this. We had a guy take a hammer to Paul Pelosi's head and Republicans joking about it. Talking about normalizing political violence. And in many of these cases, I think about the guy at the FBI building. It didn't work. But what happens if it did? What happens if an FBI agent got killed? What happens if an FBI agent gets into a shootout, as they do? It fuels this idea that we're at war with our government and these things that they call militias, the kind that tried to kidnap the governor of Michigan. Imagine if that had happened. They'd kidnapped the governor of an American state and maybe killed her. There are no militias in America. You can't be a militia. It's against the law. If you would like to enlist to help the government do whatever it has to do, you join the National Guard. That's all there is to it. The government can only activate the National Guard. You can't do this kind of stuff.
Right.
And so we have this rule of law that's being undermined. We have democracy that's being undermined. We have these world leaders like Putin, like Mohammed bin Salman, now like Benjamin Netanyahu, who are waiting for Donald Trump to be reelected because he's the best friend they ever had, and he got things out of them that they can't get out of Joe Biden. Yeah. So I do worry that we're going to have to be more nuanced in our approach. And what this last election told me is that Americans are capable of it. But we are going to have these conversations, and they can't feel like the sky is falling, but they have to feel more like what I think you just described, and that is, we don't have our democracy yet. How exciting is that, right? The Ukrainians would rather not have a war, but they really are excited about fighting for their democracy. They believe they want it. They're young. They're only 20 years old as a democracy. They want to win that democracy themselves. In our history, we think about something that happened in the 1770s. Maybe we think about the suffrage movement. Maybe we think about the Civil War movement and the excitement in those people who fought and ultimately won. We're there now. We are fighting we're actually in this fight for our democracy in our lives. We may achieve it, right? If we get all these things right. So I think that should energize people, which means 100% of people should be registered to vote. And if only 50% are registered and they all help somebody else get registered, they will vote and they get involved and they go to their school board meetings where the book banning is happening. They run for school board. They run for city council. I learned about the value of democracy when I was 11 years old because my father, immigrants, they were anti-apartheid activists. They had moved to Canada. My father ran for office for the first time when I was 11 years old. I was his biggest campaigner. And election night, the polls closed at 8 o'clock. My dad and I had been working all day, being at places where people were getting on buses and subways and things like that. This was in Toronto. Went home to get changed, get in the car. We're almost at the campaign office. It's 8 o'clock. We turn on the radio. The announcer says the polls are closed across the country, far too early to tell results, except in one constituency, which is the one my dad was running in. And they declared that he had been defeated. They didn't use his name. They just said that the other guy had been elected. And I was devastated.
Yeah.
I said, I can't believe we lost. And my dad had this smirk on his face. And he said, of course we lost. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we were never going to win. And I said, then why did you run? He said, because we could. And because I'm not getting arrested tomorrow. And because people had a chance to support me. And one day they will. And I I learned about democracy in that moment. And that to me is the end of the story. The end of the story is that my dad ran again and he won and he became the first South Asian elected to any office, that level of office anywhere in Canada. He made the history, but the history that he made was not nearly as important to me as the lesson I learned on that night when I was 11 years old. And that is democracy is a participatory process of civil society in which you do it for the right reasons. You walk away when you've lost and you lick your wounds and you come back and do it again, but you respect that process and you make it better. That lesson is the one that I now try and take forward in America.
I love that story, especially in the aftermath of some election results last week that have some people saying, let's just, instead of investing in Florida, let's put our money elsewhere. And again, I understand, thanks to the Roberts Court and Citizens United and the total evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, we do need to make strategic decisions. So that's a conversation for another time, because if that problem were fixed, then it would be a different issue entirely. But I'm with you. You fight every fight for the future, because if there's a, say, plus 40 Republican district in a rural Georgia or Virginia, and nobody ever runs, and the Republican runs uncontested every single time,
then you're not a democracy. Because those voters who don't want to support that, anywhere that there is an acclamation and a single candidate, breaks my heart.
Yes.
Let people have their choices. Be that person who gives. My father was a complete sacrificial lamb, but he said, I will give people something to vote for. And a lot of people voted for him. They just not enough. Look at Lauren Boebert in Colorado. She will probably prevail, but someone came damn close because they gave the voters a choice. Someone ran against Marjorie Taylor Greene. Didn't get a ton of votes, but it gave somebody something to vote for. Last time she didn't run against somebody. So
that's right.
These are participation in the process is not about winning. It's not about beating the other guys. It's about committing to taking care of that little cactus that you have.
And it's also about, giving people a choice, but educating them, giving them information they wouldn't otherwise have.
Correct.
And explaining that some candidates are holding positions that are absolutely antithetical to a healthy democracy. And quite honestly, I'm hard pressed at this point to come up with any Republican quote unquote policies that help their constituents at all.
Because they're not a policy oriented party right now. They once were.
Right.
But they're not. And they had great policies in the past, by the way. They came up with the Environmental Protection Agency. They came up with all sorts of things. And by the way, people didn't agree with some of them at the time. But the bottom line is it was a thinking policy party that put white papers together and had testimony and did research and used the great offices of the United States government to say, how do we protect our public lands and how do we do those kinds of things? They just don't do that anymore. They wait to see what Donald Trump thinks the policy should be, and it generally seems to be about immigration and weird things like that. Look, we have a real immigration problem in this country, Mary. We can solve it with some really good debate. We know what the best practices are, but we don't. All we talk about is the southern border and people getting over the border and rapists and all this kind of stuff. Meanwhile, we have a 3.7% unemployment rate. You know what we need? Immigrants.
Yes,
that's how your prices are going to come down. We don't have enough people to fill the jobs in this country.
No, and it's such an opportunity, and it's something I've never understood. We are obviously a country of immigrants, and it's just mystifies me that has become something that the right fights against and pretend isn't, unless of course you're white, and then it's fine.
But they also didn't used to fight about that. There were actually Republican presidents who thought immigration, particularly from the southern border, was a very healthy thing from America. There are governors all through the West who say, when you stop that flow of people your lettuce is going to be more expensive. Your oranges are going to be more expensive. We need these workers. But we've just decided that's an easy out, and Donald Trump owned that one, and it's become a mantra for Republicans that just doesn't make economic sense.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure the Democrats have done a good enough job of creating a counter. Well, they haven't. They have
You're
not.
Absolutely right.
So that's something else that they can work on. I feel like we have. I've been pulling my punches in terms of the Democratic Party. Because when you're in a situation where only one party believes in democracy, you don't want to undermine that party.
It's a binary choice at the moment.
Right.
I need it to not be a binary choice. It's not healthy for any of us where you have to say you have to support the Democrats because they're the pro-democracy party.
Yeah.
Right now it's binary.
But I think we have an opportunity to start challenging the Democratic Party to be better on some things, to make a better case. And I know our time is almost up, so I have a couple of quick questions. One, well, maybe not so quick, but do your best. One deep concern is that one of the best mechanisms for the normalization of anti-democratic, pro-autocracy, dangerous behavior is the failures of accountability. How do we move forward knowing that there are active seditionists serving in our government and the head of an insurrection who is still the leader of one of our two Republican parties? It seems to be getting less and less tenable. And the longer it goes on, the more opportunity there is to kind of fill the vacuum with, well, I guess it's just not that big a deal.
Yeah. And I think that one's on us. And I say us being the media, right? We have to tell Americans what is happening without platforming people, right? Without making it feel like you're getting equal time from them. We have to characterize what Donald Trump and others in his clown car are saying and what they want to do. And more importantly, and I think you alluded to this earlier, it's dangerous to make this too much about Donald Trump.
Yes.
Because it's in the same way that you can't blame Joe Biden for inflation around the world. There are Donald Trumpian people all around the world who are getting elected and reelected and coming back into office again. Benjamin Netanyahu reelected in Israel as a criminal. Like, it's kind of amazing. Mohammed bin Salman, who the world has determined, was behind the execution of an American citizen who was mildly critical, by the way. Jamal Khashoggi wasn't some big government critic. He was a pro-Saudi guy who wanted his government to be better. They're executing the protesters in Iran. You can't say the word war in Russia, right? There are all sorts of people around the world who are like this. It's not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is just a remarkable message bearer. So we have got to understand the nuance of what anti-democracy means. I have been pleading with my Republican friends, and they all tell me that I'm wrong in thinking that there's some possibility of taking these defectors or these people like Liz Cheney and rebuilding a party right now, so that the only option for Republicans with conservative views is actually to vote for Democrats for the time being, until things stabilize and some party rises out of the ashes. So I don't know what success looks like right now, but I do know that it resides in protecting the vote, exercising that vote, and being involved in civil society. Right? People who get involved. I spoke to a Muslim woman who ran in Georgia. She's the first Muslim and Palestinian elected in the Georgia state legislature. And it came about because she had attended some meeting about getting people to run for office, and someone interviewed her, and she was talking about the fact that she was preparing to run a marathon. And somehow there was a miscommunication, and it sounded like she was preparing to run, and that became the article. And she started getting Facebook and LinkedIn things about, yeah, you should run. Yeah, you should run. And she had never thought about that, and she ran and she won.
Wow.
That's the beauty of American democracy. This Palestinian woman who wears a hijab is now a member of the state legislature because someone mistakenly said she was running for politics. That's how easy it is to actually get involved. But it's easier to go to your school board meeting. It's easier to go to your parents' meeting. It's easier to go to your city council meeting and just show up and let those people know you're holding them to account. You as voters are holding them to account. But it's also on us as media to hold them to account all the time. That should be our primary job, not to call people on and say, tell me your view about this. Tell me your view about this. It's you are a member of a party who did this. You voted for that. I need you to explain that to me. Mm-hmm. And it's hard because those people don't want to come on your show as guests again because they feel like you took them on. Right. But that is our job. My job is no longer a job, Mary, it's a calling. I have to do that or I fail. And if I fail the American people. And if I fail the American people, we fail democracy.
That's such a great way of looking at it, because it personalizes the situation in which we find ourselves. This is not cut and dried. This is not some abstraction. This is
Yep,
our lives. This is our
that's right.
future. It's the future of our children. It's the future of people we care about. It's the future of people we don't particularly care about.
Correct. Who happen
Right?
to share our country and get a vote.
Yeah. So one more thing. We before we started, I asked if you had any hobbies, and I love the fact that you have this particular hobby, and I know you've been kind of busy. Like I'm wondering, forget about hobbies. Have you slept in the last 6 years?
Right, that would actually be my main hobby if I could get to it.
If you could get to sleeping. So assuming you could sleep and assuming things chill out a little bit, um, any plans to get back up in the air
I
anytime soon?
literally was 2 days away from my pilot's license. 2 days away. I'd completed
Oh
all of
no.
my training. I had completed all the stuff, and when you fly, because before the flight schools don't ever wanna have you fail,
Right.
you fly basically the test with your pilot, your
Mhm.
instructor, then you fly it with the chief instructor till they are convinced you are not going to fail your test. And then you schedule so you don't schedule it until you're going to fail, even though the FAA tries very hard to fail you because they should, right? It's a
Right.
safety
Of
issue.
course.
They make you do things. They basically fatigue you. If you haven't failed the test after 2 hours in the air, they'll keep you on for another half an hour till you're just fatigued and you forget something. But I was
Yeah.
ready to go, and it was right before the 2020 elections, and a hurricane came, and I cover hurricanes, as you know. And I
Yes.
just knew, because we were so close to the election cycle, that it was my last week. If I wasn't able to do that license that week, I was going to get on the trail, travel around the country, and it wasn't going to happen. And all I had was that 1 week, and a hurricane came, and I had to cancel my flight appointment, and that the rest is history, right? That election became the most contested election we've had in our history, and I never got off the road. So one day, I dream about it. I only dream when I sleep, and I don't sleep that much. But when I sleep, I dream, and I dream about flying. When you next hear that I'm in a plane, it means the world's a better place, and we're moving toward democracy. So I could take 2 hours and go up above.
I love that as a benchmark. And as you may know, I'm very fond of people who fly and aspire to fly. So I absolutely hope that for you. Allie, this has been such a pleasure. I'm so grateful for everything you do,
Thank you.
have done, continue to do. I love that you consider your work a calling. We need more people like you in the media. So Ali Velshi, thank you for
And we
everything.
need more people like you. And this is a tribute to the American people who also decided their business, their existence is a calling. So we're all in this one together.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali.
See you, Mary.
Bye. Thank you so much for being here. I just had the best time. Thank you to Ali Velshi. What a guy. Seriously, I've admired him for a very long time. And so to have him come on to spend so much time with us is really an honor. And I really appreciate it. So thanks for your comments and for hanging in there with us tonight. We will be back, the Nerd Avengers and I, next Tuesday for our regular Nerd Avenger show. That's Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. That's youtube.com/Politicon. And is next Thursday Thanksgiving? I think it might be. I'm not entirely sure what the show is going to be. There will be one. I'm just not entirely sure what it's going to look like, but that's also going to be at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, youtube.com/Politicon. And when you are on Politicon's YouTube page, please subscribe. Doesn't cost anything. We just want more people knowing about the show and getting the word out. While you're there, you can also like the episode, leave a comment, click on that bell, and that way you will be sure to be alerted anytime a new episode drops. And what else? Yep, of course, you can listen to this in podcast form anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you're on Apple, please do leave us a 5-star review because it helps other people find the show. And that is a goal, obviously. And don't forget, we are having our very first Mary Trump show live on stage on Monday, December 19th at 7:30 p.m. Pacific. That's it at Dynasty Typewriter in Los Angeles. And fellow Nerd Avengers, Jen Taub and Waj Ali will be joining me on stage, along with a special local guest, which will be a surprise. And I think that is it. Once again, thank you to Allie and thank you to all of you for being here. I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Have a great weekend. And in the meantime, please stay safe and be kind.
Thank you.